Very rarely in Islamophobic conversations do people say that terrible treatment is deserved or earned because of that. And so in anti-Palestinian racism, it manifests in terms of framing Palestinians as inherently hateful, inherently violent. There's no reason behind their violence. It just comes out of the ether and manifests why Palestinians are in the state that they're in. So that's another way that anti-Palestinian racism manifests. And this is, I think, the most important part of understanding racism.
Welcome to Curated Conversations, a podcast discussing real-world issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. I'm your host, Shalisa Jamal, founder of Curated Leadership, an organization that fosters partnerships with individuals and companies to develop their knowledge in the areas of equity and diversity to build inclusive communities. Welcome to Curated Conversations, a podcast discussing issues related to equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. I'm your host, Shalisa Jamal, founder of Curated Leadership, a team that fosters partnerships with organizations to develop their knowledge in the areas of equity and diversity to build inclusive communities. I'm here joined by Beisan Zubi for episode 23, season 3 of Curated Conversations. Beisan has been working as an anti-racism and equitable governance consultant for 6 years. She recently pivoted to a full-time public education work role on the subject of anti-Palestinian racism after launching the growing resource anti-Palestinianracism.com, and is currently producing a web series and podcast to support this work. She has worked in many sectors, including startups and innovation centers, think tanks, and even on Parliament Hill. She was also the only Palestinian to run in all of Canada in 2021 federal elections. She currently lives in Kitchener, Ontario with her partner and 2 dogs. Welcome, Beisan. So excited to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Yes, me too. So, you recently created the website anti-Palestinianracism.com. And you talk about this need for shared understanding of anti-Palestinian racism that has never been more urgent. And we know this from what's been happening around the world, not only from October 7th, but for 75 years plus. Can you tell us a little bit about the impetus for this page and what you hope it to do? What's the goal?
Yeah. So I grew up in a time when, Palestinian identity was not even discussed, let alone understood, right? And now it's discussed, but still not understood. And so it seemed really weird to me that we still had, after personally growing up in Canada, living in Canada my whole life, dealing with anti-Palestinian racism my entire life, no kind of accessible resources for educators, parents, people who have, Palestinian friends, coworkers, employees to actually understand what the manifestations of anti-Palestinian racism look like, how they show up in our lives, and how to be, an ally to Palestinians in combating anti-Palestinian racism. So I created that website resource to be an accessible, non-technical kind of resource for people who just wanted to find out more and who wanted it in an accessible format. So that I launched that, I guess I would say in March or even in February of this year. The result and uptake has been really, really high, showing me that there is a real need for it and a serious interest on the part of non-Palestinians to learn more about anti-Palestinian racism and to be partners in combating it. And yeah, in this moment where so many people are talking about Palestinians, but in a lot of harmful ways and in a lot of really kind of traumatic or traumatizing ways for Palestinians. It has never felt kind of more pressing or more urgent that we have these resources that we can call people in and kind of say, actually, when you said this kind of relied on this racist trope, please try and do better in the future. Just even having a tool like that, a resource for people to use and to be able to say, it's not just me that feels this way, this is kind of pretty well documented, this is the way a lot of Palestinians feel.
Mm-hmm.
It hopefully will fill in a little bit of a gap there, and a little bit of a gap that we've, had to be dealing with for, I mean, my whole life here in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, there's resources that exist about Islamophobia for sure, and other kinds of racisms that do intersect with anti-Palestinian
Mm-hmm.
racism. But I think what was really important about this resource is showing the ways that anti-Palestinian racism is different, and how it manifests
Mm-hmm.
specifically towards Palestinians and our allies, in ways that people are a lot more aware of what Islamophobic tropes are, or what anti-Arab tropes are, but they don't really
Mm-hmm.
see Palestinians and anti-Palestinian racism within those, or adjacent to them when they appear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I really appreciate that you said it's like non-technical and it feels like your website is very accessible, easy to read, easy to understand, because right now more than ever, especially with the rise of social media, and all the different platforms, people are looking for information bites. People are looking um, to get involved. And so I think your website does a great job of kind of bringing all that together. And as you mentioned, right now in this moment, we are seeing a mass violent displacement and genocide of Palestinians. Folks are calling it maybe a second Nakba or repeat of 1948. And as you mentioned, we've seen an increase of Islamophobia and anti Arab racism. And you're mentioning this term that's quite new to me is anti Palestinian racism. Could you define it for our listeners, please?
I mean, yeah, so it's in my working of it, in my working of the definition, there are definitions out there, right? So different ones that relate to anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia differently than mine does. I make the distinction of it being adjacent to, but not exactly the same as Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, because anti-Palestinian racism manifests distinctly when it comes to Palestinian identity. So it does things like pretends Palestinians don't exist, which, nobody pretends Muslims don't exist. Nobody pretends Arabs don't exist. But the actual invisibilization and, like they're a fantasy, like this is what people are being told about Palestinians, that is very unique to anti-Palestinian racism. There are other places where the intersection is there. So, for example, terrorism and the war on terror. We understand how that relates to Islamophobia, but very rarely in Islamophobic conversations do people say that terrible treatment is deserved or earned because of that. And so in anti-Palestinian racism, it manifests in terms of framing Palestinians as inherently hateful, inherently violent. There's no reason behind their violence. It just comes out of the ether and manifests. And this is, why Palestinians are in the state that they're in. So that's another way that anti-Palestinian racism manifests. What it seeks to do, and this is, I think, the most important part of understanding racisms, is that they're not just like these natural or common sense outcomes that we've come to. There is an actual purpose there. There is an actual intent behind it. And the intent behind anti-Palestinian racism is to normalize the situation and the suffering of Palestinians, to kind of create it as a status quo, to allow for the invisibilization of Palestinians, to ostracize Palestinians and their supporters from public dialogue. All of these kinds of threads are all woven together in order to just keep perpetuating the suffering and oppression of Palestinians, like to kind of maintain the status quo. So whether it's like they don't exist, or they do exist but they deserve this, or they deserve this and they're violent and you don't want them in your country, like there are all these different kinds of racist tropes that all work together. But the goal of it is to just normalize and justify our oppression and suffering in our homelands.
No, I appreciate you saying that and the uniqueness. And, I'm thinking about how in the media, the word Palestine is not even brought up, right? It's Hamas and Israel war, for example.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know the historical background or when that was erased. And also thinking about passports, I asked a Palestinian woman, about their passport, and she said, no, it's not written as Palestine, it's written as West Bank. Can you talk to us about where these erasures came from?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you have a bit of history to share with us, but how and when did they come to be?
Well, I think that they've come over time, because at first Palestinian identity was actually a lot similar to Islam, like a Muslim identity, in that it was almost amplified, and it was kind of the first they tried saying, "Oh, this is a huge threat. These are, you know what I mean." With when it came to the days of the PLO, for example, the power of the PLO was in magnitudes over amplified in order to create Palestinians as a threat, and uniquely that. And then that kind of shifted into, no, Palestinians don't exist. Palestinians never existed. They are just an invention. And so it's definitely been something that has changed and moved over time, depending on the needs of the people who were, perpetuating this racism. Um, right now, we are in kind of this really weird territory where, like, I'll post online and half of them will be like, Palestinians are, violent, this, and that, and the others are Palestinians don't exist, and so it kind of seems like we've hit a point in the zeitgeist where all of the different kind of cognitively dissonant things that they say about Palestinians are just like banging against each other. And it's like kind of like a monkey with the cymbals. Like, I'm just like, you're making noise, but none of this is actually coherent. So I can't really tell you what's next. I'm not really sure, to be quite honest. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, like we have kind of come to, I think, a little bit of a turning point where
Mm-hmm.
you can't say we don't exist and we only exist to do bad things. Like, those two things are
Right.
just like, those are like oppositional thoughts that you're holding in your head right
Mm-hmm.
now. So which one is it?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that
Mm-hmm.
we have kind of reached a point where our existence is undeniable. Our
Mm-hmm.
history has been well documented. And I really think that what we need to kind of start pushing is our futures and
Mm-hmm.
our, where we're going from here, what we see as equality, what we see as liberation, what we see as peace, and have those conversations, because I think that
Mm-hmm.
the history has been um oh, used against us in a myriad of ways, depending on the flavor of the month, right? And so
Absolutely.
moving away from that is really where I think our liberation and our equality lies.
Absolutely. And I want to get into that. But before I do, you talked about anti Palestinian racism as being adjacent to Islamophobia and anti racism and anti Arab racism. I apologize. But specific and different. I mean, I know you mentioned that a few times. Could you tell me how and why, or in what ways you see these terms being
Yeah,
conflated, and
for
maybe
sure.
how they're similar and how they're different?
For sure, because there are a lot of the similar tropes that apply across the board. For example, there's a great book by this man, an academic named Jack Shaheen, called "Real Bad Arabs," real REEL, and it goes through the portrayals of Arabs in Hollywood. So all like these terrorists, like, storming through a building, these joking, like, making fun of, wearing the keffiyeh, for example. There's a scene from that Leslie Nielsen movie, like the cop kind of satire, like those kinds of depictions of Arabs were seen as commonplace, and Palestinians were almost like this stereotypical real bad Arab for a while, right? However, in the ways that Palestinians have, like, so we talked about the kind of erasure or invisibilization. Palestinians are often referred to as quote unquote Israeli Arabs. So the Palestinianness is taken away from us, and we're just Arabs. Like there's nothing other than Arabness there. There's no other
Mm-hmm.
identity there. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
one of the ways where I think that it's adjacent but not the same, because our Arabness is actually used to diminish our identity. So to just say it's a form of anti-Arab racism also kind of works to diminish our identity as Palestinians, because it's not just a form of anti-Arab racism if we are called Arabs to invisibilize us, right? We need to be conscious of that history. It's also adjacent to Islamophobia, but not the same thing, because it also that works to erase the Palestinians who are Christian. Like my mother is from a Palestinian Christian family, and there's a long line of Palestinian Christians who exist and who want to be recognized. And so to lump in anti-Palestinian racism under Islamophobia also just completely erases their identity, erases their Palestinianness, right? And so, what we have kind of come to understand is that we need our own term that acknowledges the multitudes of Palestinian identities, the way that they intersect with Arab identity or Muslim identity, but they're not all just this one kind of overlapping circle. There are Palestinians who deserve to be seen and deserve to be recognized that do not, fit into just anti-Arab racism or Islamophobia as neat boxes. And so, yeah, that's why it is related to those two terms, but we really needed our own term to kind of define the way that it treats us, or that it addresses Palestinians in all of our multitudes of identities, and not just as Arab Muslim Palestinians, which not every Palestinian is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really appreciate you bringing this multitudes or multi layers of identity, because for me, when I think about the conflation between Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, I think that that's exactly the point: is to lump people together and therefore create this othering and this fear, which for me goes back to Orientalism and Edward Said's work on that. To think about, okay, we're going to lump everyone together, everyone who falls into any of these categories. In this case, we're talking about Islam and Arabs, and say, okay, all of these people are to be feared. And because Palestinians may have some of this overlap, they're also to be feared, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like an easy way for the media or powers that be to create fear. And it is actually successful. And
Mhm.
so for me, I want to get back to that kind of question of Palestinian sovereignty, because I've had these conversations with my friends, and I've watched a lot of like TikToks and things like this about Palestinian people wanting to stay in Palestine, those that are currently there, despite the violence, despite the heartbreak, despite the famine that's happening. And I remember saying to my friend, like, what can we do? And she said, well, Palestinian people have said they want to stay there. And our job is just to advocate. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit to me about what you said in terms of the current state, maybe futures of Palestine, returning home, rebuilding. Talk to me a little bit about that and what you know or what you've heard.
Yeah, Palestinian people have been fighting their displacement for over 75 years now. This is nothing new to us. Even when Palestinians leave, they leave their hearts behind in Palestine. Like this is just like a common saying. So for example, like my grandmother's brother's family still has the key to their house in Haifa, and they hold on to it. That house was taken from them. They were let out by a militia at gunpoint, and they never got to return to that house. My aunt kind of lives like a 10-minute drive away from it, and it's this specter in her life, right? And so we're definitely holding on to that past, because I think when something that's such a kind of grave injustice happens, it does define a people. That kind of intergenerational trauma does kind of get passed on. So there is a lot in our culture about returning, the right to return, the right to kind of be in our communities and be equal citizens on our land. And that is a non negotiable, I think, to any Palestinian. The way that kind of happens, I think that's where you kind of get the nuance, and you get all these kind of conversations of, well, what do we want? How do we do it? What's the timeline? All that stuff. I'm not here to kind of presume what peace and justice looks like, right? I think that that's, such an undertaking. I think really what I want to kind of do is just force that imagination onto other people of what peace and justice could look like. And so I think that we have a duty here to listen to Palestinians, to advocate for them, to advocate for their visions of peace and justice. I, as a diaspora Palestinian, I am privileged. I have all of these kinds of rights that and privileges that people in my family do not have, right? Like, I have a passport that allows me to go to whatever country I want to go to. I am seen as an equal citizen in the country where I was born. I am allowed to drive on all of the roads. Like, all of these kinds of very, very basic quote unquote rights that we take for granted here are not rights that other people, or other Palestinians, sorry, have, who live in the Holy Land, who have lived in the Holy Land for generations and generations and generations. And so that can't be a part of our brighter future, right? We recognize that that is not justice, and that is not any kind of maintainable status quo. So
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm very excited in this moment, thinking about all the different um, people and groups and movements that have kind of come together to be part of Palestinian liberation and Palestinian future making. And so I think that in this moment we have about as much sadness and hope as we've ever had, right? And so there's just terrible, terrible things going on every single day. But even just seeing people in Gaza who have noticed what's going on in university campuses in the US and who are feeling hopeful for themselves and being heard and being seen in a way that they never have before. The fact that that can happen at the same time as just massive destruction and devastation, it keeps me focused on, like, just how kind of complicated all of this is and how many different factors are at play here. But that, that saying of, like, it's always darkest before the dawn. I try and remind myself of that. I try and remind myself that we are that hope is it's a discipline, right? That we have to keep working at, and that we have to keep kind of reminding ourselves that there's always hope, and there's always hope for better. And so that is the kind of future that I see of us kind of being equal partners in our liberation, and us seeing all these other allies across the world who are invested in our liberation. And you can't kind of put that, toothpaste back in the tube. Like, once that's out, once people see that, it's out, it's for everybody. And so I do feel like a lot of hope in this moment, even though it's a dark moment.
Yeah, you said hope is a discipline, right?
Yeah.
I love that. I love that because it
It's a quote.
reminds
I
me of
have
like
definitely ripped that off from somebody. I think I'm
oh,
not
okay.
gonna get it
Okay, no, I love that because it reminds me of like Duncan Andrade's work around critical hope, and
Yeah.
even Tupac's work around the rose that grew from concrete. The rose that grew from concrete. Um, growing up, of course, that's kind of some of the role models that I was looking at to look at liberation. And I think what you're reminding me is that it's not a binary. It's not either or. I think that the work of liberation, the work of combating anti-Palestinian racism, the work of recognizing Palestine as a state, doesn't mean that you are not recognizing other states, right, and other peoples. And I think oftentimes the media or people make us choose between the struggle for Palestinians versus the struggles for folks in Israel, for example. And a lot of people say, even with these campus um, encampments or protests that by nature of standing up for Palestine, they're inherently anti-Semitic. Can you talk to us about maybe where that comes from and why that may not be the case?
Yeah, so I think that it's both anti-Semitic and anti-Palestinian to say that Palestinian safety and joy is at all or countered to a Jewish joy, safety, peace, right? For me, those two things go very, very much hand in hand. We are all free when we're all free. And so there is no freedom or safety or justice that comes at the price of somebody else's freedom, safety, and justice. And that's just like a fundamental principle of kind of my worldview, my framework.
Absolutely.
And so that's why I just completely reject any kind of implication that Palestinian safety, Palestinian liberation could come at the cost of Jewish safety and Jewish liberation. In fact, I think that they go hand in hand. But what we have seen is people who are manipulating the legitimate fears around racism and anti-Semitism in order to justify anti-Palestinian racism. And that is something that we need to call out. And I see so many Jewish comrades doing that work, and that's such important work. But they're doing it very, very well. Like if we look at even these encampments on university campuses, you can see they're doing Shabbat prayers. They're having like Kabbalah sessions, like they're having people come in and lead prayers that are multi-faith. Like they are very, very conscious of their spaces being spaces that are anti-oppressive, and that means for everybody. And so um people will say what they want to say when they want to justify um terrible things. But when you actually pause and look at who is behind a lot of the most meaningful and progressive Palestinian liberation organizing, it's Jewish people. It's people who say not in my name. It's people who are saying what was done to my ancestors is terrible, and never again means never again for everyone. And so we have all of these very clear statements coming out of the Jewish community. And granted, like a lot of Jewish people are Zionists and not on side, but I also value them and I value their lived experience. We just definitely disagree about this issue about how safety comes and how collective liberation works and what that looks like. Um I think that that's fine, but I hope to change their minds. I hope to change their minds that a future where every faith can live freely and equally in the Holy Land is a better outcome than what we have right now. It's a far better outcome than what we have right now. And so
Absolutely.
I don't think that that is really that hard of an argument to make. I really don't think it's that like I don't think anybody's having a really great time right now, to be honest. So, I mean, if we talk about shared outcomes and we talk about better futures, I'm always talking about for everybody. I'm never talking about one group at the expense of another group. I
Absolutely.
think that it's anti-Palestinian racism that allows people to paint Palestinian liberation as coming at the expense of other people's liberation and coming at the expense of other people's freedom or safety or anything like that, when it does not and should not. It comes at the expense of occupation. It comes at the expense of subjugation. It comes at the expense of segregation. But those are bad things, and we should all be on board with getting rid of them. So
Absolutely.
I
And I
do. I
and I think
reject
it
this idea.
yeah, and I think in history this is not a new thing. It's been repeated time after time after time that all of our freedom is bound together and therefore our liberation, is bound together. So I think that's kind of a very important message. And can you tell me a little bit why you think that the Palestinian struggle itself matters or should matter to Canadians, Americans, and maybe the global community?
Well, I think it's because we're complicit in it, right? Like, we are, whether or not we, acknowledge it, we're funding it. We are turning the other way at the most egregious kinds of human rights abuses. It's really, it's not just about Palestinian, um it's definitely about Palestinian lives, but it's not just this far away conflict that we have no say in, that we have no impact on. We're funding it. We are allowing our politicians to minimize like extreme civilian suffering, extreme, like, man-made famine. Like, that is not something that we as quote unquote, progressive societies, these like Western minded societies would ever say that we're in favor of, would ever should ever say that we accept as the reality for others. um we of course have problems here at home in Canada, but those problems are, again, like all of our liberation, if we take that as our framework, that all of our liberation and all of our rights are intertwined, we can draw direct lines between decolonization in Canada and decolonization across the world. Like, we have to understand that we're not doing anything really in a vacuum. Everything that we do and everything that we say is is part of what's happening on a global level. And even, if Palestinians um had sessions with Black Lives Matter activists in Ferguson, telling them how to deal with tear gassing and their kind of practical techniques when it comes to dealing with a violent police state, suppression of their right to protest. Like, these are shared learnings that have been happening for a really, really long time, and that solidarity has been there. It's just, it just needs to keep growing, and it just needs to keep kind of snowballing into a global
Mm,
solidarity movement, which is where I see
mm.
it going for sure.
Absolutely. And I'm reminded back to when you talked about Ferguson, about the way in which students have been coming together from high school to university. And this has all been the case for many, many decades, centuries, even, right? If we think about even, in the Far East, in the West, I'm thinking about the Little Rock Nine. I'm thinking about, protests in Cairo, in
Yep.
Morocco, in Palestine, even, right? In other cities, all university, college students, high school students have been um, advocating, have been protesting, have been working towards liberation for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's not something new. And I'm also feeling quite hopeful about it. That there is some traction, there is way more recognition. When I went to university at York about a long time ago, I will say, but in 2000, let's just say, um, that is when I started really learning about Palestinian liberation. And at that time, we didn't have mass social media outlets. But even from then, I feel like the amount of awareness and the conversations we're having with folks is just multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. And that awareness for me is one piece. Something I get asked a lot about is, how can people show their support? How can people be allies? How can people have these conversations? And how can people take action? So there's kind
Yeah.
of four asks there. But the first thing is, yeah, how can people show their support?
I always kind of advocate for showing your support where you are. Like, there's a group of people who trust you and who know you. I don't know who they are, but I know that those are the people that you should start with, trying to kind of get them on board, because we have networks of like spheres of influence in all of our lives, and a lot of people are like, but I'm just a intern, or I'm a barista, or whatever it is, whoever your circles are, focus there, start there, have these conversations with your friends, with your family, with your coworkers, whoever it is that you are closest to, who come to you already to know your opinions on certain things, because that just makes sense, right? A lot of people are like, I can't go from 0 to 8,000 in like one day. I'm like, nobody should expect you to, right? Protests and like showing up and showing and being a body at a protest is a very helpful way, but it's not for everybody. There are ableism issues around that. There are location issues. So if you don't have weekly protests going on, there are other ways too. Obviously, talking to your networks, but writing your elected officials. There is a little formula that people don't really talk about very much, but in political circles, a politician is fairly aware that if they receive one letter or one phone call on an issue, they probably have around 100 other constituents who also care about that issue, but just not enough to like, make that phone call and make that leap, right? So if they get 1,000 phone calls on an issue, that to them means they have 100,000, like their entire constituency basically cares about this issue. So recognizing that when you do that kind of math, that your voice isn't actually going to be a drop in the bucket, but it's going to be over amplified as far as a politician is concerned. They're going to care even more that you took the time to reach out to them, means that it's definitely worth it to make an appointment to have a conversation even with your elected officials. So you can do that by just Googling who is my, MPP, or
Yeah.
who is my member of parliament. That, like, Google will have that location for you, and they will literally just tell you who it is. Like, there's very little guesswork that you would need to do
Mm-hmm.
in order to be able to do that. So yeah, that's another way. Another way is by making a different choices with your kinds of personal finances, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
like, so for example, if I know that I'm buying from a company and they employ sweatshops to kind of create their products, I am choosing to either absolve them of that and say I'm okay with that, or I'm saying, no, I'm going to keep my money and put it somewhere else that doesn't have like labor practices that I'm uncomfortable with. The same thing with,
Absolutely.
different kinds of social and political practices. If a company is, supporting Israel and the IDF in different ways, you can just say, no, I don't want to, consume anything that you have to sell because I have other options. And as a consumer, that's my right. So like
Absolutely.
boycotting, divesting from, and eventually those calls to your public official for sanctions to Israel are economic pressures that we actually saw was a key to ending apartheid in South Africa, and I think will be
Mm-hmm.
key to ending, the system of apartheid in Israel. So
Mm-hmm.
we have so many different tools available at our disposal, just as individuals, just as like normal
Mm-hmm.
people without, access to levers of power. And so use them, try using those, see how that kind of treats you. If it's at the very least, if you have maybe an encampment in your town, go bring them some water or help
Mm-hmm.
support
Mm-hmm.
them somewhere, give them some moral support. There's a lot of things that you can do that are super practical, that feel really good, that are low like a low load for
Hanging
you so that
fruit.
you can do a
Yeah.
lot of them. And those are where I would just suggest anybody start.
Absolutely. And I think folks always come to me and say, I don't know what I don't know. So I think anti-Palestinian racism.com is a great website to start, and we'll put some more resources if you share them with us as well. But I really like what you said. There's ways we can use our own individual power and then collective power, and writing to elected officials. So as we come to the end of our conversation, we've talked about a lot of things that can be super intense for folks and is personally connected to you. Can you tell me, in all of this, what brings you joy?
I think seeing young people today out and demanding better, and just the way that this younger generation has really taken on the mantle of progressive change and not accepting the status quo. I just think of, like, I was a millennial. We were so apathetic, and like there was so much stuff that we did that was just so problematic. And like the way that these young people have changed their language and changed their ways of organizing and interrelational kind of dynamics to make them more equitable, it gives me so much joy and so much hope to see them do it. And I just kind of, I want to support them. Like, I'm cool with just spending the rest of my life like supporting the next generation of like really changing this world for the better. And um so that gives me joy. That gives me, it sustains me. Other than that, like a non-political answer is just like family and my dogs and, my partner and just like, being safe and being happy. Like all of those things, like as terrible as the world, events that we see on our screens like 24/7 are, um it's so important to remember to be grateful for what you do have and just to be centered in gratitude. Because I think that when we lose that, everything can seem really hopeless and it's hard to find joy in things and it's hard to see beauty in things. And for me, the joy and the beauty is the hope, right? Like it's they're so connected to each other that we can't allow ourselves to lose the joy and the beauty in life, and to see those moments of hope in the darkness. Because I really really want to hold on to what we're fighting for, right? That brighter future for everybody, that future where we have liberation, where we have equality. And I don't think we get there if we lose hope. I don't think we get there if we forget about joy, if we forget about beauty, if we don't self-sustain, if we don't take care of
Mhm.
ourselves. So um yeah, I think even in Rezi, you can see moments of joy and hope. You can see like
Mhm.
entertainers going into the refugee
Yes.
camps to like, make do shows for the kids who are there, who are displaced, who lost everything. Like even, people will try and use that hope against us. I've seen all of these terrible like posts of like, oh, look at the Gazans on the beach. Doesn't look like a genocide. When I'm like, they can still have one day of jumping into the water. First of all, they're living on tents on that beach. It's not like this is like a vacation for them. They've literally lost their homes and everything they have. The fact that they still have a little bit of freedom to go run in the Mediterranean and just feel a little bit of water on their skin and just bask in the sunshine, to me is not indicative of anything other than that hope for the future, that beauty that kind of makes its way through the darkest kind of moments. And I think that that's something that should humble us and should really recenter us, that if even people going through a genocide can find literally just one moment for joy, one moment for laughter, one moment
Perfect.
for something other than pain, we owe it to ourselves to allow them that, to respect that, and then also allow it for ourselves, and to allow it to refocus us when we get back to that
Mhm.
really hard work of justice making.
Absolutely. I think those have been the most inspirational moments for me as well. That, in everything and despite everything, they're finding pockets and moments of joy for themselves. And it's absolutely beautiful.
It's
Thank
the
you for
spirit,
highlighting
it's the
that.
spirit of humanity that
Yes.
can't be defeated, and I think we need
Beautiful.
to remember that. It can't be defeated, it won't be
Yes.
defeated. We wanna encourage that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you'd like to share with our listeners before we end today?
No, so like I said, the anti-Palestinian racism.com, it's a growing resource. So I would love it if they took a look at it. There's a little form where you can send your feedback in, and I would love to hear about more feedback. I've already gotten so much, very, very helpful feedback, things that, the whole kind of web series and podcast came from people being like, this is really great, but I want to hear about it. I can't just read all of this. And so I'm very, very happy for any kind of constructive feedback on that website, as it grows. And yeah, thank you. And to everybody else who is passionate about anti-racism and about anti-Palestinian racism, because really that's how we change things. That's how we make things better for everybody.
Absolutely. So we'll put that all in the show notes, and any other resources that Bisan and I come across. Maybe we can put some websites for folks to support or learn more about how they can support, including some links to elected officials and how they can connect with them. It's been an actual absolute pleasure chatting with you today, Bisan. I'm excited for future collaborations. Thank you to Yes, thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you so much, Beisan, for joining me today. Thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Curated Conversations. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, share it, subscribe to our newsletter, continue the work, and stay connected with us on Instagram at curatedleadership.com. And we look forward to hearing you speak again. And thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time on Curated Conversations. Thank you so much for tuning in to Curated Conversations, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and share this episode. Subscribe to our podcast or listen to past episodes at curatedleadership.com or wherever you listen to your podcasts. To learn more about Curated Leadership, visit us at Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Curated Leadership. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Curated Conversations.